All right.
Good morning, everyone. Um, Welcome to the Data-Driven Safety Analysis Virtual Workshop presented in cooperation with Vision Zero Central Florida Initiatives and the Federal Highway Administration and MetroPlan Orlando. This workshop series will explore how geometric road design, traffic control, and other factors affect road safety. Participants will learn crash prediction methodologies from the AASHTO Highway Safety Manual. My name is Mike Wilson from MetroPlan Orlando, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the second of these three workshops. Today's workshop will be recorded and available to rewatch on the MetroPlan Orlando YouTube channel. If you have any questions during today's workshop, please type your question into the Q&A box or the chat at the bottom of the screen. This workshop will be led by John McFadden. John is a senior geometric design and safety engineer for Federal Highway Administration's Resource Center. He provides technical assistance and technology deployment services for the agency on data analytical applications in geometric design and highway safety. John has published several journal papers focusing on geometric design of highways, traffic safety, and operations. He also served as a panel member of various research projects sponsored by the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. Prior to joining Federal Highway, John worked with the University of Alabama as a faculty member in civil and environmental engineering, as well as various consulting positions. So I will hand it over to John to kick off our second day.
Thanks, Mike. Welcome back, everybody. So today we're going to continue building upon what we started yesterday, which is the application of data-driven safety analysis through the Highway Safety Manual tool as applied to freeways, ramps, and ramp junctions. And we're going to get into the weeds a bit today by looking at first the first of two tools, ISAT-E, which is an Excel spreadsheet that can be downloaded from the highwaysafetymanual.org website. So let me segue here to share my screen. So if you recall yesterday, I went to the highwaysafetymanual.org website, and under tools, you'll end up here that at this location where we see for part, and let me refresh your memory, part A of the HSM is more or less an introduction into highway safety. The idea of traffic crashes being random events that are a result of system failures between the driver, vehicle, roadway factors, and basically setting the groundwork for why there's the need for a tool that estimates the inner relationship that exists between geometric design decisions or treatments that we put in the roadway, and then the corresponding effect of those decisions on crash risk. Then we get to part B, as I mentioned yesterday, which involves the roadway safety management process. And in the Highway Safety Manual, as a part of it, they reference a few different resources here. The first is AASHTO Safety Analyst. This was a pooled fund study, an NCHRP study that developed a software tool to help with network screening, diagnosis, countermeasure selection, economic appraisal, priority, and then evaluation of those countermeasures. It is not the only tool that exists. Many states have adopted their own tool to deliver the HSIP process and help with that delivery. This is one where I guess there's a handful of states, let's say 5 to 10 states, that participated in this and developed this safety analyst. But there are other state-based tools that are, and the oftentimes what I'll get from a state is a question, well, should we separate from the current tools we're using and adopt the HSM related tools? And my general reaction to that is, are the tools currently working for you? And before you throw anything out, I would really vet and examine, well, what benefit does switching to the other tool provide you with? And if you don't have a really solid foundation by which you are and understanding of the benefits of the whatever it is you're switching to, I'd be a little bit cautious and put my toe in the water and play around with these tools before blindly adopting them. And that's kind of the purpose of a lot of the workshops we deliver through the Resource Center. So you'll see a couple other under this Part B roadway safety management process. We have the SPICE tool, CapEx, and SPICE is for intersection control evaluation, examining the safety performance. CapEx is the capacity analysis for junctions, so it's relative to what we're talking about in the context of this workshop. VDOT has a junction screening tool called VJust that's also shown on the site. But and that is the Part B component to the Highway Safety Manual. We are focused on Part C, the predictive methods. And as a part of that, you'll see IHSDM at the top in this highwaysafetymanual.org site. And then additionally, we have the spreadsheet tool. So today we're going to talk about, for freeway analysis, the Enhanced Interchange Safety Analysis Tool, or ISAT-E. And if you have the ability and didn't do it yesterday, this is an opportunity. If you click on that link there, it'll take you and deliver, when you download it, 2 files. One is the Excel spreadsheet. The other is the ISAT-E user manual. And if you were to open up that user manual, you would see this is kind of the instruction set for how to apply DDSA to a freeway ramp or ramp junction using the NCHRP 1745 methodologies. And it does a pretty good job at teeing this up. And in fact, when we deliver this workshop in person, we walk through step by step each of the data elements necessary for the delivery of a predictive analysis on a freeway ramp or ramp junction. And, you know, and maybe even more importantly, the implication and when and where it's appropriate versus when and where there's some limitations with this methodology. So I love the fact that the kind of set of instructions, even though if I ever went and bought a piece of furniture at IKEA, the first thing I do is throw the instructions out and just try and put the thing together. And about an hour or two later, after frustrating myself, I'll go back and look for the instructions. So part of me thinks sometimes the best way for me to learn is to just jump in and play around with the software and get lost and make mistakes. And then I'll come back once I become frustrated enough to the instructions and actually walk through in a systematic fashion. We're going to try and avoid that frustration today and just go right to the instructions and deliver the message of how to apply these theoretical concepts using that ISAT-E Excel spreadsheet. And we're going to start with freeway segments. So again, this is broken up into 3 groups. You should have the PowerPoint on freeway segments. I'm going to go as far as I can and get through as much as I can in these 3 hours. But again, as I mentioned yesterday, typically we deliver this workshop over a 2 to 3 day period in person. So you're getting kind of like the Cliff Notes version of this workshop. So there are 2 other PowerPoint files that I would typically go through, the freeway ramps and ramp junctions. That these 2 PowerPoints will also be emailed to you later today. And hopefully I can get through some of them, but I'll go as far as I can with respect to ISAT-E. I do believe, though, once you see how we apply this to freeway segments, you'll start to understand conceptually the logic of ISAT-E, and when switching over to ramps or ramp junctions, it's not going to be as much of a challenge because you're just going to be applying the same type of logic here. So what we want to do this morning is describe the modeling steps, describe segmentation and how to do good segmentation, and then examine the data inputs necessary to do data-driven safety analysis using the Highway Safety Manual on freeway segments. So I showed you the ISAT-E user manual, and yesterday I also showed you the NCHRP 1745 final report. Those 2 references in combination with the Excel spreadsheet can all be downloaded for free and basically allow us, regardless of whether we own the Highway Safety Manual or not, to apply the concepts of data-driven safety analysis using the methodologies within the highway safety manual, and basically deliver an analysis that we can make a more informed investment decision about our project. So we showed this slide yesterday, and I had mentioned the idea of what we're doing with the HSM predictive methods. We are basically taking samples from states on roadways of different functional facility or functional classes or facility types, and producing a model that is an estimate of a population parameter for prediction of crashes using different predictor variables. So for SPFs, the primary predictor variable for freeway segments is segment length and ADT. And then what differs will be the coefficients associated with this model. As you see in the model form, A, B, and C are going to be what differ from facility type to facility type. You'll have different SPFs. But then also, this is where, when we talk about calibration, if states were to start developing their own SPFs, and I'm not suggesting that's necessary for every state, but rather what I'm suggesting is it's good to start with the highway safety manual model form, see how it performs by developing calibration factors. And then if you have an interest, there may be an opportunity for those facilities that the national models aren't performing as well as you would like. That's where we would prioritize, well, what facility types would be most appropriate for our state to start developing SPFs and CMFs, because the national models are not really an accurate reflection of the interrelationship that exists between our geometric design variables, traffic variables, and crash risk. So you can see for freeway segments, the HSIS database that was used to develop these models, the data for freeways came from 3 states, California, Washington, and Maine. So you can get a feel for there may be some differences in performance based on behavior of drivers and environmental and other contextual elements that are natural to California, Washington, and Maine that may not be representative of Florida or other states throughout the country, which necessitate a calibration of the model to reflect what's going on. And what that calibration basically does is, if you look at the figure here at the bottom of this slide, it'll adjust up or down that for each of the different SPFs, the coefficients will adjust up or down based on when you calibrate it, whether the model is over or under predicting crashes for your location. Okay, so we've covered the regression coefficients are A, B, and C. Again, this becomes like a tree diagram in that we split up into multiple SPFs that are related to the facility type and area type for their application. So we start with urban versus rural, as I mentioned yesterday, the number of lanes, and then also crash type and crash severity are separated as well. So we have a separate model, for instance, for urban 4-lane facilities predicting single vehicle crashes that are fatal in injury. And we would have then a separate model for urban 4-lane facilities predicting single vehicle crashes that are just PDOs. And then continuing to fill out this urban 4-lane facilities, multiple vehicle crashes, fatal and injury, and then multiple vehicle crashes, PDO. So it's kind of separating the models by different crash severity, crash type, facility type, and area type. And this is important that we apply the models. This is a challenging enough effort if we do everything as intended. If we, and what I see most or as the greatest opportunity for user error is not necessarily picking or applying the models as they were unintended, but selecting the wrong model that doesn't reflect the context with which your project involves. So that's primary, number one issue here is making sure when we go in to the spreadsheet, that we select the appropriate combination of area type, facility type, number of lanes, crash type, and crash severity that we're predicting, and follow suit as we go through the full analysis. Okay. So now, as I mentioned yesterday, the model form for HSM prediction involves you're predicting crashes as a function of an SPF or safety performance function. And then those safety performance functions, as I mentioned, are broken down or subdivided or into different categories based on, again, area type, number of lanes, or facility type, crash types of crash severity. And then we have the adjustment factors, or CMFs, associated with that. Now, these base conditions characterize the CMF of 1.0 for these different features. Now, the segment variable, in this case, base conditions apply for both the multiple vehicle and single vehicle crash prediction models. So the SPFs for multiple vehicle and single vehicle crashes. So we're on a tangent section, a horizontal tangent section. Our lane width is 12 feet. Our inside paved shoulder width is 6 feet. The median width is 60 feet. No median barrier. And the proportion of the ADT volumes that occurs during the hours where volumes exceed 1,000 vehicles per hour per lane is none. So in essence, what that's getting at is you've got, from a level of service or capacity perspective, you're dealing with a free flow environment where the geometry is kind of dictating the combination of operating speeds and influencing the behavior of drivers more so than once you get to level service C or lower, where traffic volume kind of dictates the operational performance of the vehicle. Okay, continuing with the base condition. Now here are a set of base conditions that are strictly for the single vehicle crashes. The outside paved shoulder width is 10 feet. No outside shoulder rumbles, or excuse me, total shoulder rumble strips. Clear zone is 30 feet, and the outside, no outside barriers. And then at the bottom of the screen are the base conditions for the multiple vehicle crash models, strictly for multiple vehicle crashes. The distance to the nearest upstream entrance ramp is greater than a half mile from the segment boundary, and the distance to the nearest downstream exit ramp is greater than a half mile. And the base condition has a type B weaving section, or no, excuse me, no weaving or section in that analysis segment. Okay, for ramp entrance and exits, the base conditions are shown here. Horizontal tangent, 12-foot lane widths, inside shoulder width of 6 feet, median width 60 feet, no barrier, and again, the proportion of ADT volume that occurs during the hours where the volume exceeds 1,000 vehicles per hour per lane, that's not occurring. So we are in an uncongested scenario. And now, again, coming back to the nomenclature, the initial edition of the Highway Safety Manual, HSM 1.0, published in 2010, but specifically this freeway section under NCHRP 1745 was published in 2014, names the CMFs in Part C, and there are 13 total. When we get to HSM 2.0, these will be designated as adjustment factors to differentiate them from Part D CMFs. So here we have 13 of these CMFs, and most of them are functions of the geometric variables, and they were developed with the same data that were used to develop the SPFs. So this is why they're now going to be called adjustment factors, because they're closely tied to the models that were, or the data that were used to develop the models for the SPF, meaning it's the same exact data set. So that's why these CMFs, by definition, were developed in coordination with the SPF development, so we can deploy this predictive methodology. And they were calibrated to work in combination without overestimating safety influence, meaning we're trying not to double count the crashes. So for these adjustment factors, if I go back for a moment, under the base conditions, one assumption of the Highway Safety Manual in its current form, when you multiply this SPF, predicted crashes, by the CMFs or adjustment factors, what is implied there is this assumption of independence. Because we're deploying this multiplication rule in statistics, each of those elements needs to be independent of the next. And we know under certain scenarios, there may be overlap, meaning if I'm dealing with a horizontal curve, lane and shoulder width directly influence, I shouldn't say directly, there may be some influence or overlap of, if I correct for a horizontal curve and I widen the shoulder and lane width around a horizontal curve, the CMFs associated with that, if we didn't control, could double count. And what they're indicating here in the research, that they did calibrate this so that they work in combination to be compliant with that assumption of independence. Let me scroll out. Hey, Gary, I see you wrote a question here. In one of the analyses we recently reviewed, had a minimum speed limit on the ramp section was set to 50 miles an hour, but our project had a speed limit of 35. Is the speed limit range hard-coded? Thank you. It's a good question. So to this point, and when we get to it, speed is in terms of the Highway Safety Manual, it's incorporated into a couple of the facility types as a direct predictor variable, but not many. And you may ask, well, how can this not be? It comes up a lot when delivering this training. How do we not incorporate speed into this analysis for some of the methodologies? The short answer is, when they ran the models, the data tells us what the data tells us. So they put speed limit in there, and it just didn't rise to the level of statistical significance to be included in the model. I'll speak parenthetically here. If you look generally at other research that's been conducted examining speed as it relates to predicting crash variability or explaining crash variability, the speed itself, or for instance, speed limit, wasn't, as far as I know, I haven't seen it be highly correlated or found to be statistically significant predictor in explaining crash variability. But variability in speed was found in research. So it's not so much the speed itself, but variability in speed that has been found to be correlated with crash risk. It's a great question, and we'll come back to that both this week and next week when applying these models. I touched on this yesterday, that the need for calibration and to account for the difference, the spatial and temporal difference between the where and when the models were developed to the where and when they're being applied. And they capture some of the issues that are shown here: climate, driver populations, animal, crash threat reporting thresholds, and so forth. Okay, if you have the HSM, you'll see they have this flow chart to show you how to get from A to F or A to Z on applying the methodology. So they have characterized, there's 18 steps in this model. And for our ISAT-E software implementation, we're going to look at a 7-step process where the first 6 are the same as the HSM, and the 7th step is automated through the software, the spreadsheet. All right, so let's dive in here and take a look at some of the data elements and how this is organized. So there are multiple worksheets within that file, that ISAT-E Excel file. And what you see is the way the logic behind this spreadsheet. Each blank row identifies each category and has a light gray background. And the categories are identified as your basic roadway data, your alignment data, your cross-sectional data, roadside data, your access data, which is your ramps, and traffic and crash data. So here you get a visual of the input worksheet for freeway segments. Let me segue for a moment and just take you back to Excel for a minute. And if you were to open up the Excel spreadsheet, this is what you would likely see as your opening screen. So, and you can see across the bottom here, if I bring this up, I can see you're not seeing what I'm seeing. Let me pull this up. So now you can see a little better, but across the bottom of the iSAT-E spreadsheet, you see the different tabs, and I'm putting my mouse on. I'm at the welcome tab. I'm going to scroll over and click on the introduction tab. And here in the introduction tab, they kind of walk you through the different highway safety manual, philosophical approach, the methodologies, the facility types that can be used, and worksheet selection, and so on and so forth. And it's kind of giving you an intro into the iSAT-E and the different data elements, the pull down menu. The other thing I want you to share with what this first presentation is focused on is this tab, the input for freeway segments. So, well, I should say before I get that, you have the main tab that gives you your specific project descriptive elements, and you plug that in, and that's regardless of what facility type you're going to be looking at. And then we're going to today focus on, initially anyway, freeway segments. So let me come back now to the script here. Okay, and now what you see on this slide is a cut and paste image of the input worksheet for freeway segments. So as shown on the bulleted list here, it starts with your basic roadway data, and then it starts to ask specific questions about the context of your facility, number of through lanes, the segment length, and then alignment data, cross-sectional data. And as you scroll down, you'll go through each of the bulleted items: roadside, access, traffic, and crash. Oops. Okay. So the 7 steps involved in this process: first, we define the project limits, then the study period. We need to acquire traffic volumes and crash data. I should have prefaced this discussion. There are critical data elements necessary to run these models. You can get away if you don't have a complete inventory of data for your project. You can make some assumptions, but they're rooted in this, the primary data variables necessary to run this. If you don't have traffic volumes, there really is very little you can do, because the foundation of these models in the SPFs involve the traffic exposure, traffic volume, and segment length. And then the other geometric variables are also crucial for each of the CMFs that are associated with those elements. So this is capturing the traffic volumes and crash data, critical; geometric traffic control data, critical; and now dividing the project into individual sites, which is by definition segmentation, is also critical for our analysis. And then once we've done that, we can take our observed crash data and assign it to those individual sites or segments that we created. And once we've put all this into the Excel spreadsheet, then we can run the analysis and get the results. All right, so let's walk through step by step how this procedure works. First, defining the limits of a roadway section of interest. So this may equal the full limits of the project. It may only be a short length of road within the project. It depends. And it may include one or more of the following. So you may be interested in just the freeway segments, just a ramp or CD road, or just a ramp terminal. Or you may be interested in the full project that includes all three or some parts of all three. Okay, so if your project is large enough, let's talk about the boundary or limit of ISAT-E. So the limit of analysis that ISAT-E can do in any one file are 20 freeway segments, 40 ramp or CD road segments, and 6 crossroad ramp terminals. So what ends up happening, if you exceed that, you're going to have to separate it into multiple files. Okay, now, again, setting this up again, defining the project limits. First, we need to establish a reference line for the freeway, for each ramp, and for the CD road. So for freeway segments, typically what's used is the inside edge of the traveled way for the roadbed serving traffic moving in the increasing milepost direction. And for ramps and CD roads, we use the right edge of travel way in the direction of travel. Okay, defining the study period. The study period may be a future period or a past period, depending on the purpose of the study. So these are consecutive years for which an estimate of the predicted and expected crash average frequencies is desired. Our crash period are the consecutive years for which reported crash data are available. And then the evaluation period are the years separately evaluated with the predictive method. And this combines both the study period as well as the crash period. So this language is embedded in the HSM and in the NCHRP 1745. And it's important to be aware of these three quote unquote time periods that we are using in the analysis: study, crash, and evaluation. And here's a good visual capturing what we speak of. So our crash period is the data that we have, the observed crash history data. The study period, it can be past or future. And if we want to deploy EB, the crash period is needed. Meaning we need the observed crash history to be able to apply weights to the predictive and the observed to come up with an expected value. And then you can see how the evaluation period encompasses both the study and crash period. Let's see, is there a question here? Oh, okay. Okay. Moving forward, now we're kind of building this house of how to do this analysis. Now let's get into the data requirements. These are the traffic volume and observed crash data. So all of the volumes are AADD, or in vehicles per day. And the mainline AADT for each segment, this is bidirectional, or both directions of travel, is required. So too are the upstream entrance ramp AADT and the downstream exit ramp AADT. And we also, based on that CMF on high volume proportion, need to identify the proportion of ADT volume that occurs during hours where volume exceeds 1,000 vehicles per hour per lane. Now, I'm not sure to what extent your jurisdiction has this level of detail as we look at the temporal changes in volume, but this again is linked to a CMF that the base condition is 0. And if you have in the heavily congested corridors, you start to see volumes exceeding 1,000 vehicles per hour per lane. We'll want to estimate what proportion of that ADT occurs during the hours where you're above 1,000 vehicles per hour per lane. Okay, and the data can be manually entered, or the tool can also calculate based on historical data. And we'll touch on that a little more as well. All right. Continuing here, 5 ADT values that are required. First, the ADT volume of the freeway segment, both directions of travel combined. Okay, now the second data element for ADT, increasing milepost travel direction, the ADT volume of the nearest upstream entrance ramp of the segment. And we identify that as B, ENT. So it's the volume at the entrance ramp, as well as the AADT of the nearest exit ramp downstream, or B sub EXT. And then in the decreasing milepost direction, similarly, you need the AADT of the nearest upstream entrance ramp, as well as the nearest exit ramp downstream, identified as E sub ENT and E sub EXT. And here's a good visual capturing this. The other presumption here is that those ramps are located within a half a mile of the segment that we're analyzing. If they exceed that, then they, from the analysis, don't directly influence safety performance if they're greater than the distance to the nearest upstream or downstream entrance or exit is greater than a half a mile. So you can see here on this slide, the study area for the segment is in yellow, and you see the distance from in the, as we go from left to right, we are dealing with the increasing milepost. So from west to east is left to right. That's the increasing milepost. So we need the number, if it's within a half a mile of that segment, that AADT sub B for the entrance ramp, and then AADT sub E for the exit ramp. And then for the decreasing milepost direction, the corresponding AADT sub E for the entrance and AADT sub B for the exit. All the measurements are to the marked Gore point. So when we're looking at this distance, X sub B for the exit, X sub E for the entrance, X sub B for the entrance, X sub E for the exit, these are all focused on and measured from the Gore point to the segment, that segment limits. Okay. Now, step 3 involves crash data. And if we, as I mentioned yesterday, want to deploy the empirical Bayes analysis, it requires crash data be input. And each segment's crashes, 1 or more years, are determined. And then these crashes are characterized by severity as well as type. Again, we want to be consistent with the model's predictions. So the models and the SPFs for the models are broken down by crash severity and crash type. So we need that same level of detail if we want to deploy EB for those disaggregated SPFs by severity and type. And then step 4 involves collection and delivery of the geometric data. So here we're looking at number of lanes, length of the segment, horizontal curve data, lane, shoulder, and median widths, rumble strip length, length and offset of barriers, the presence of type B weaving, we'll get to that, distance to the nearest ramps, and clear zone width. Okay, so walking through each of these individually, starting with number of lanes. These are the total number of through lanes in both directions. So the models are able to handle as many as, in an urban context, 10 total lanes. In a rural context, 8 total lanes. So a question that often comes up, what if I have 12 or 14 lanes? Then you would be extrapolating outside the bounds of the model. And you cannot, as I mentioned before, it's hard enough if we do everything as the model intended. So the misapplication or extrapolation beyond the intended bounds of the model is not recommended. Let's continue here. Segments with lane adds or drops have the number of lanes just downstream of the add or drop. We do not incorporate HOV or managed lanes into this methodology in its current form. There's been some research into HOV and managed lanes. I have to go back and get a refresher. I'm not sure if that's been completed, but this has been a hot topic in recent years that has, I think, spurred at least one NCHRP study to examine how to deal with managed lanes or HOV lanes. Auxiliary lanes in weaving sections, they have to be at least 0.85 miles to be added as a through lane. And then speed change lanes have to be at least 0.3 miles to be added as a through lane. And then these speed change lanes are measured from the gore point to the taper point. And that gore point is where the gore is 2 feet wide. Okay, so here's an illustrative example of that information here. So we're looking at number of lanes, beginning milepost, end milepost. So here for our number of through lanes, it's 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the downstream lane count. Is there a ramp entrance in this segment? No. A ramp exit in this segment? No. A type B weave in this segment? No. Same thing on the right. Number of through lanes, this is the downstream lane count, would be 4 with no ramp entrance, exit, or type B weave for this. Okay, now length of the segment. This is measured in miles. We're focused on homogeneous segments. So we have to, in cases where something changes that directly impacts the prediction, we have to subdivide into a separate section or segment. And it's measured along the inside edge of the traveled way in an increasing milepost direction. Oops, we got a couple questions here. John, that high volume proportion, I believe it's just for the main line. And can you elaborate on, I'll confirm that. Derek's going to be here next week to help with the IHSDM. I'm pretty sure that high volume proportion is just for the main line. Then Gary, can you please elaborate on the empirical bays? My understanding, EB will be helpful in assessing safety at locations with limited crash data based on another location where crash data is available. I could be wrong. Spend a few minutes when possible. I understand EB will be helpful in assessing safety at location with limited crash data based on another location where crash data is available. Yeah, Gary, I'll let me put a pin in that question and walk through this because it's an interesting topic. This idea of EB and how to apply it in this context, as well as the other facility types. You know, there are some tricks to this that can be deployed. I'm presenting it as it was intended, but there are some ways to kind of or nuance to this that incorporates what you're describing there, how we can leverage data from other sites to help and analyze a current site. All right. Horizontal curve data. Now it starts to get a bit, you know, when you start thinking about a horizontal curve by direction, these lengths of the segment based on where the horizontal curve is and where your position is inside or outside may differ. So whether on one or both roadbeds as well. So for divided highways, there may be, as shown on the right, in the increasing milepost direction, there's no horizontal curve. In the decreasing milepost direction, there is a horizontal curve. Or on the left, where we have a concentric curve, it's both directions. The increasing and decreasing mileposts have horizontal curves. Now, for our segment, the length of the curve in the segment on the curve on the left is captured here. You can see the segment length on the left is the dashed line, and you see the PT is about halfway through the segment, but the curve doesn't continue through the entire segment. So the length of the curve in the segment cannot exceed the total length of the segment. And you can have a curve that exists in more than one segment, as illustrated here on the left. On the right, the entire curve for the decreasing milepost direction is in the segment. So we'll have a subset of that to incorporate that horizontal curve. And now we get to the cross-sectional elements. So we have lane width, and this is the average lane width for all lanes, both directions. The inside shoulder width, this is the paved inside shoulder width, average both directions of travel. The outside shoulder width, average width of both directions of travel, and then the median width, distance between the edges of the travelway. That rumble strip length reflects for both the inside and outside shoulders. See, a new question came in. Mainline meaning, yes, mainline meaning general use lanes. Yes, Arturo. Okay, lengths and offsets to barriers. So our median and roadside barriers, the offset to the edge of the traveled way, and these are only objects within 30 feet. And then this is the width of the continuous median barrier. And for varying offset lengths, we typically do some averaging of this. So here is an example for barrier offsets. Each piece here is represented by its average offset, W sub off, comma, IN sub I, and length for IB sub I on this. So we alternatively could recognize that the offset is the same for pieces 1 and 4 and 2 and 3. So each pair can be combined by adding the two lengths, L sub IB1, L sub IB4, and using the common offset length. So there's net, you can average these things out. It will yield the same result. And by simplifying it, it alleviates some of the data entry elements. Okay, we had mentioned type B weaving a few times. Let's get into that for a moment. What are the characteristics of type B weaves? One of two weaving movements can be made without any lane change. The other movement requires at most one lane change. And then both exit and entrance ramps are on the right side of the freeway. Okay, so how do we measure this length? It is from the gore point of the entrance ramp to the gore point of the exit ramp. If that length exceeds 0.85 miles or 4,500 feet, we do not consider this a weaving section. It becomes a lane add or a lane drop. So here are illustrative examples of this type B weave. Again, going back, one of two weaving movements can be made without any lane change. The other movement requires at most one lane change. And then both the exit and entrance are on the right side. So you can see the different configurations on the left for type B weave. A, major weave with lane balance at the exit gore. B, the major weave with merge at the exit gore. And C, the major weave with merge at the entry gore and lane balance at the exit gore. contrasted with other types of weaves that require, again, more than one lane change to complete the maneuver. Okay, now we'll get into calculating the distance to the nearest ramps. These are measured from the segment boundary to the ramp gore point. If the value is greater than a half mile, then we just code it as 999. No impact on safety. The upstream entrance and downstream exit ramps are the ramps of interest, and this can create significant CMFs for lane change. So here's an example of lane change CMF for a ramp location and the given ADT for an upstream entrance and downstream exit. So for this example, what you see, the ramp is not of interest to the evaluation of the subject segment because we're not interested in upstream exits and downstream entrances for our analysis. Okay. And then all the measurements are from gore points to the segment. All right. I've been going let me pause here. I'm trying to the best of my ability, respond to questions as I'm proceeding through this. If I miss, or sometimes I have to put a pin in them because there's some depth you have to get into in explaining some of these concepts, and it's going to come up later in the presentation. So I hope you don't feel as though I'm being evasive, but rather kind of putting a pin in it because we're going to get to those concepts. So I'll pause here. Any questions or comments to this point? If not, we'll take a quick break and then come back at 5 after the hour. All right, we'll see you in 10 minutes. All right, let me segue back to the PowerPoint here. All right. The again, going with the lane change CMF, the ramp location, when we enter this ramp B, entrance is in segment at milepost 0.00. And again, the criteria here, the gore width at 2 feet is the starting point of the segment. So this ramp would be in the segment of interest. So we would need the AADT for that ramp, that entrance ramp. Okay, clear zone. The CMF for outside clearance is calculated based on an average outside clearance or clear zone. So the travel way to the edge of vertical obstructions, and it has to be within 30 feet. Anything over 30 feet, you meet the base condition. And we don't include this if a barrier is present. And for instance, fence lines, tree lines, non-traversable slopes, utility poles are examples of these types of obstructions. If you have one of these, a single or lone tree or like objects, they shouldn't be included. If it's an outlier, just one exists. And now step 5, we divide the project into individual sites. We're focused here on homogeneous segments. And these are based on freeway segments, ramps or CD road segments, or crossroad ramp terminals. And this is critical for the proper analysis to be conducted. So when do we separate or subdivide our project into multiple segments? Anytime we see a change in the following characteristics: traffic volume, number of lanes, lane width, shoulder width, median width, clear zone width. And what this should connect with you is the idea that these are directly linked to the predictor variables for CMFs. Okay, so if, for example, we have a project like this and we want to divide it into homogeneous segments, it is going to involve the breakdown as shown here. We got freeway section 1, FR1, FR2, FR3. We got CD road 1, CD2, CD3, CD4, CD5, and then you have ramp entrance 1, ramp exit 3 and 4, and there should be there's ramp entrance 2, and then you've got exit 3, 4, and 5 as illustrated here. So this is an illustrative example of, for segmentation, how do I break this up? You can see for the purpose of our freeway segment that we're focused on in this section, there are 3 distinct freeway segments in this project limit. Okay, so the definition again of that freeway segment: the length of the freeway in miles, multi-lane, 2-direction of travels, physically separated by a median, relatively constant cross-section, similar roadway features, similar traffic volumes, and no more than 1 exit and 1 entrance ramp for each direction of travel. Okay, so here is the criteria again for when to segment and begin a new segment. So if the number of lanes change, rounded lane width changes above a 1/2 foot. So the round to the nearest 1/2 foot increments. The rounded shoulder width changes to the nearest foot. A ramp is present, and then that gore point defines the start of the segment. Rounded median, if less than or equal to 90 feet, changes. So, and that's in 10-foot increments. Rounded clear zone width changes, and these are 5-foot increments, or rounded off to the 5-foot. Speed change lanes also can define a new segment. If there's accel or decel lanes, or they have a and they have to have a gore or taper. So in setting up your analysis project, one of the key elements is defining the segments for segmentation as a result of segmentation. So here we have an illustrative example of the segmentation process for a freeway speed change lane. And you can see the ramp entrance length, the taper point shown, the gore point shown, and for the exit ramp with taper design, the ramp exit length, the gore point. And you can see A are all crashes that occur in this region are speed change crashes, where B, all crashes are freeway segment crashes. So this is where the nuance comes into play. When we start our segmentation and establish the segmentation throughout our project, then we're going to come back and look at the geospatial information related to our crash occurrences, the observed crash history, and place those accordingly in the different segments. And based on the type of segment we're dealing with, there are different models that will be used to predict those crashes. Now, I mentioned that I touched on the fact you need geospatial data related to your crash data in order to be able to allocate the crashes at the specific locations within the segments that we've created. This can be a problem if you don't have that. If you just have the total crashes over the project limits, then we would have to basically use project level EB as compared to this site specific. If you do have, excuse me, I've reversed that. If you don't have the exact location of the crashes, then we're just allocating the crashes across the entire project. So that's site specific. So crash information is not adequate to locate the crashes accurately within the segment. For project level, the EB method, if many segments are short, conceptually relocate features defining segment boundaries to produce longer segments and the predictive model estimate alone. So in this case, we are unable to do the EB for that project level because we cannot differentiate. So there are cases where the EB is either going to be a challenge or we have to make broad assumptions about the distribution of those crashes across the project limits. And that's based on the level of location data related to the crashes that we have. Okay, so typically what we would end up doing now at this point in the workshop in person is we would give you an example here that shows how to separate and segment a project that's of interest. So in blue, we're identifying the gore points first. So this is how, if I was presented with a project, I get an aerial photo of the project limits, and I would start off by showing the gore points. And then in red, we identify the change lanes. In purple, you'll see the project limits. So by direction, we're showing the different change lanes, starting first, going from bottom left to upper right in the increasing milepost direction, and then coming back the other way in the decreasing milepost direction for our different lane or change lane conditions. And now once we've established that, we can build our segments. So segment 1, that freeway segment, segment 2, where we go from the end of that segment without the speed change lane, or with the speed change lane in the down decreasing milepost direction up to the gore point of that entrance ramp. Segment 3, from that gore point to the entrance ramp up to the speed change lane, from that speed change lane to the gore point of the exit ramp, from the gore point of the exit ramp up to the next speed change, and so on and so forth. And you just, with that segmentation, you've created a new analysis segment that requires the data to be input separately for each of those segments. I cannot impress upon you enough the idea of segmentation and its role in the prediction. There's a level of precision needed or required for us to get some sort of accurate representation of the results. And a key to that for freeway analysis is the segmentation process. So in reviewing this, one of the key elements here are project boundaries, segments, timeframes, the CMFs, the data inputs that we use, ADTs, lane change, speed change lanes, curves and barriers, and that kind of captures modeling for the freeway segments. So I want to just segue back to the spreadsheet for a moment and illustrate what this would look like. So at this point in person, what we would end up doing now is a group project where we take, and I give you the example of I-70, and we've inputted into ISAT-E to run an analysis. I just kept the information from the downloaded file, and I want to share with you. Initially, when you start off a new project here, and this is just the sample project, the first thing you're going to do under the main tab is establish the general information for the project. And then you're going to run through and identify the first and last year of analysis, and then the first and last year of crash data that you have available. And then you can segue or identify, do we have data for this site? So we either don't have crash data for all segments combined, meaning we're basically distributing those crashes uniformly across the entire project because we don't have good geospatial data. And then we may have data for each individual section or segment available, where that geospatial location information related to the crash history is available, and we can apply it to the different segments we created. So in doing that, this is again what we download from the highwaysafetymanual.org website. So you would start in that main tab and set the project up. And then starting with the segments, we would break, and for the file you download, they have 4 segments. It's more of a dummy example of project, but of a project. But what you can see here is the data elements necessary. So you see the number of through lanes, the segment description, so where the station starting point and ending point. So you go from station 0 to 475.20 for segment 1, and then the segment length in miles. And then it goes, that's the roadway data. Then you go to the alignment data. Are there any horizontal curves? If not, you move on to cross-sectional data. You put in lane width, outside shoulder width, inside shoulder width. And what's interesting here, if you at any point have a question related to the data element and what criteria is associated with it, that there's a little red triangle that provides you additional information. So for instance, number of through lanes, data entry element, the total number of through lanes in the segment, both directions of travel. Rural freeways are limited to 8 lanes. Urban freeway segments are limited to 10 lanes. It also gets into no HOV or managed lanes, do not include any auxiliary lanes. So all those caveats that we touched on in the PowerPoint are also available in the spreadsheet to remind you the applicability and criteria for each data element that we would consider. And so from that perspective, the spreadsheet itself does a pretty good job at minimizing the entry error, because it's basically giving us those instructions within this spreadsheet itself, very easily available. So for instance, here for lane width, average through lane width, if that varies, take a weighted average, and you can see the range is 10.5 to 14. Shoulder width, go to shoulder width, range 4 to 14. Now let's, for instance, say I tried to put in 16 feet. If it's outside the range, the cell will not allow that to be entered. So I'll just cancel that. So there is, in some cases, this is provides protection against data entry error if you put an outlier in. However, it only controls for it if you're outside the range of values that are acceptable for the data element. Let me continue, make this a little larger here. Maybe difficult to see. As I scroll down, you can see lane width, outside to inside shoulder, median width. Again, here for median, click on the red triangle and it gives you more detailed information. Rumble strips, inside and outside shoulders, median barriers, and the idea of the length of the median barrier. Roadside data, presence of barrier, ramp data, and in increasing versus decreasing milepost direction, and then your traffic data. So also the proportion of ADT in the average 24-hour day where the hourly volume exceeds 1,000 vehicles per hour per lane. So that lane volume per hour is, in essence, the equation is captured there, where the volume during hour I and N is the number of through lanes. Let me see if you do that for each direction, increasing, decreasing milepost, you put the ADTs in. And if you just put one value, it will run that value continuously. If you put a value 85,912 for 2005 and then 2028, well, I should also go back. We've established our first and last year of analysis or of crash data, and the first and last year of analysis, 2013 to 2015. So when we put in our crash or our traffic volume data, we have 2005 data. It will pull from that data and use it accordingly in the predictions if that's the only crash or volume data you provided. Scroll down, and there's the crash data again for the time period we have broken down by multi-vehicle, single vehicle, ramp entrance, ramp exit, multi-vehicle, single vehicle, and this is fatal and injury versus PDO, and then any advisory messages. So let me segue back for a moment to the very beginning of this presentation where we looked at, I want to go to this slide. So recall, we have the crash period, the study period, and then the evaluation period. So for this, our crash period in Excel is 2005 to 2007. Our study period per the main tab is 2013 to 2015. So from this, our evaluation period is going to be 2005 to 2015. So it covers the full width of that range from the crash period to the study period. Okay, and then just very simply, once I input all this data into this freeway segment spreadsheet, I can come back into the main and perform calculations. If I click on that, it'll run the numbers, and then you can go to the output for the freeway segments, and it will provide you the CMFs for the output and the crash predictions for your model. And you can see the 2005 to 2007 crash data, the crash period, and then the study period, 2013 to 2015. And the output summary then will provide us total number of crashes. And this is where you will pull from. Let me zoom in a bit here so you get a better view of this. So under the output summary tab, it provides you the estimated number of crashes during the study period, and the estimated average crash frequency and crashes per year during the study period. What's the difference here? The study period encompasses 3 years. So that's spitting out 120 crashes in 3 years, and then they break it down by year, as well as across the CABCO scale. So how many fatal, injury A, B, C, and PDOs. And you've got it broken down. We didn't get the ramps or ramp terminals yet, but the first part is just the segments themselves and the predictions. Okay. So that is a quick hitter on the segments. Let's take a look now at the ramps. And again, I share the sentiment that this workshop, again, is a Cliff Notes. We're not getting the level of detail that you would if we deliver this in person over multiple days. It's just the nature, the content, especially for freeways, ramps, and ramp junctions. There's there's more data elements in this methodology than the other three combined. And when I say the other three, 2-lane rurals, multi-lane rural, and urban suburban. Okay, so in this case, now let's start to explore how can we model and predict crashes on ramps. So as a part of this session, we'll look at the different types of ramps that the HSM can analyze and predict crashes for. We'll again show segmentation for those ramps, the data elements necessary, and then describe the depth and detail of the results. Okay, so the ramp types that we're able to analyze here for service ramps, exit, which end at a crossroad, entrance starting at the crossroad, CD roads and ramps within the interchange, and then connector ramps where you have freeway to freeway system interchange ramps. Okay, so here are common combinations that were basically able to be modeled and analyzed with HSM. This brings an important issue. Your configuration may not be represented by something shown on this screen. So what do we do? Well, much like dealing with the highway capacity manual, there are cases where the sites that we apply the HCM analysis methods to aren't a one-to-one fit. Transparency is crucial. So what you'll try and do is try and identify which of these configuration most closely represents the context of the project you're working on. And if it's if you can't even consider your site to fit into any one of these, then maybe this approach is not at this time the appropriate way to do data-driven safety analysis. There may be an alternative approach to consider. And we'll talk about that as well a little bit later today and next Friday. But you can see, looking at the different configurations, you have diamond, park close, free flow, loop, button hook, outer connection, direct connection, semi-direct connection, collector, distributor. What you don't see, diverging diamonds, spuies. Why don't we have those? Well, if you think about it, in order for us to quantify the safety effects of different configurations, we need those configurations have existed for enough time period to produce data that we can model. So for some of these newer interchange forms, they're just at the time of the publication of this NCHRP 1745, we didn't have enough of sites to be able to perform analysis on those. So it's something, I think it's a nature of the highway safety manual beyond even freeway analysis. It's the nature of what we do for two-lane rural intersections, multi-lane rural, urban, suburban, and so on and so forth. Is there's a huge matrix of combinations of facility types and the actual attributes that we're trying to fill and check within the research, but we can't get it all done at once. So what typically we end up doing is picking the low-hanging fruit where there's a lot of data and a lot of representation. So diamond interchanges are a good example. That's the most common interchange form in the country. So that is one of the first ones that was analyzed. And then you get your park lows and your free flow loops and so on and so forth. So you may ask, well, why did they pick these? Oftentimes it's not that they picked them, it's that they were using where there was the most data available. And that's a reflection of which configurations are the most common throughout the country. Or I guess I shouldn't say throughout the country, I should say in those HSIS states, California, Washington, and Maine, because that's where the data were taken from for the models. Okay, so now for those ramps, if we look at the SPFs to predict the crashes on the ramps, you can see the SPF again involves two predictor variables, ADT on the ramp and the ramp segment length. And then you have your coefficients there, again, A, B coefficient, and the ramp type will also have a separate SPF associated with it, as well as the crash severity. So you see we have break it down, fatal and injury versus PDO, and area type again, urban versus rural, number of lanes on the ramp, and the corresponding ramp type. Okay, I'm trying to see. So we also again predict for multi-vehicle versus single vehicle crashes, and then for fatal and injury versus PDO. Okay, the CMFs for ramps, these are mostly geometric in nature. And again, the data that were used to calculate the SPFs. So those crash and ADT and segment length data used to develop the SPFs, the same sites were used to develop the CMFs for this. And again, that will be called adjustment factors in the second edition. So here are the base conditions for the CMFs for ramp prediction, or in this case, CD road as well. Horizontal tangent, 14-foot lane width, shoulder width, 8-foot right, 4-foot left, no barrier, no lane add or drop, no speed change lane, no weaving section. And that captures the CMF information. Our input data includes number of lanes, the length of the segment, horizontal curve data, the average off-peak freeway speed, our lane and shoulder width, and this is for paved lane widths and shoulder widths, the length and offset of the barrier, the presence of weaving for CD roads, type of traffic control at the ramp terminal, the traffic volumes, and then crash data if we're going to use EV. I should mention, I talked about before, to run these models, if you don't have ADT data, it can't be done. But if you have ADT data, you don't have crash data, you can still run the predictive side. If you don't have all of the CMF related data, you can make assumptions. Meaning, for instance, let's say we're doing an existing analysis, and the only thing I'm considering is changing the lane width. So I have the existing and proposed scenario. Well, given the fact that the only change I'm considering is changing the lane width, I can set the other factors to the base condition and just focus on altering the one element that I'm actually considering changing to see what impact that would have on the crash performance. But it is necessary, you need the ADT and length data to run the SPF. And then once you have the SPF predicted, the adjustment factors, if you're only considering one or two of them, then you could make assumptions that everything else remains constant, and I just alter those two. So there's an it depends type of nature to how we run our analysis, and in consideration of what it is we're actually trying to accomplish and what we have power or control over as a part of our project. What are we considering changing? The same being said for design exceptions, where you're just focused in on that one design element and what impact that has. It's one of the reasons why when I started yesterday, I mentioned that design exceptions are really a practical way to dip your toe in the predictive method water, because it doesn't require as much effort as a full project level analysis requires, where you're getting the detailed data for every specific element within the project, and you have to do the segmentation and so on and so forth. For a design exception, you're looking at one targeted area of the project, and you can run the analysis just on that area, and it doesn't take nearly as much time. Okay, the input data, number of lanes, length, horizontal curve, off-peak freeway speeds, lane, I covered this already, lane and shoulder width, length and offset the barrier, presence of weaving, CD road, type of traffic control, volumes, crash data. Okay, looking at the number of lanes. Total number of through lanes on the ramp segment. And this visual kind of captures that. The segments with lane adds or drops have the same number of lanes just downstream of the add and drop. And the length is measured from the upstream taper point. Oops. Again, reiterate, the managed lanes or HOV lanes are not a part of this analysis methodology. Auxiliary lanes that exist in weaving sections have to be at least 0.3 miles or 1,600 feet to be added as a ramp lane. Otherwise, we would code that as a lane add or lane drop. Speed change lanes associated with a second ramp, at least 0.19 miles or 1,000 feet, are added as a ramp lane. Otherwise, it's coded as a lane add, lane drop. And turn lanes at the ramp terminals are not included. It's the length of the segment. And this is again measured in miles. And we're looking again for homogeneous segments measured along the right edge of the traveled way in the direction of travel. And we need stationing for that entire ramp when dealing with horizontal curves. So our horizontal curve data, this is needed for curves prior to or in the segment. And we have the need for the milepost at the beginning of the curve measured along the right edge of the traveled way. And our length of curve, if we're using spirals, we use an effective curve length. And this is measured as the midway distance from the point of spiral TS, that's point of tangency for the spiral, to the point of curvature for the spiral, and from the reverse, the curve to spiral and spiral to tangent. The radius of curve, length of curve in the segment, and this cannot exceed the total segment length. So by definition, the length of curve, if the curve captures the full length of the segment, then they're going to be the same. It cannot be greater. And this comes up, you'll get an error message, or if you try and do that. So you can have one curve in multiple segments, which is captured in that last bullet. And then our cross-sectional elements, your lane width, your inside shoulder width, your outside shoulder width, and sometimes you have to average those values if they vary throughout the segment. Length and offset to barriers. And this is for both sides of the ramp. Barrier offsets to the nearest edge of the traveled way, and we are only speaking about objects that are within 30 feet. If we have varying offset lengths, typically we just average. You're getting a feel for, and one of the other things I mentioned about me and IKEA furniture, where I just jump in and try without any instruction to put this thing together. I do like the idea when dealing with any of those Excel spreadsheets, doing sensitivity analysis, where you go in and you start adjusting and changing the variables one at a time to see which factors have a greater impact or influence on safety performance. And this is kind of how you start to develop some engineering judgment about those predictor variables that offer the most explanatory power for our crash prediction, or the greatest influence. And sometimes this process, it just takes time and experience of applying it over and over again. So again, weaving on a CD segment, we measure the length from gore point of the entrance ramp to gore point of the exit ramp. If again, it exceeds 0.3 miles or 1,600 feet, we do not consider this a weaving section. That would then indicate or necessitate in creation of a lane add or a lane drop. And again, we're focused in the segmentation process of creating homogeneous segments. So in this case, you can start to see how this road or project was separated into homogeneous segments. So you got, as shown before, in this case, we have each ramp is its own unique homogeneous segment. And has a separate analysis component to it. Okay, definitions here. A ramp begins or ends at gore points. So a new segment is required if we see a change in the number of lanes, you have merging ramps or CD roads, diverging ramps or CD roads, or you have right or left shoulder width changes. Now, you might say, John, you just contradicted yourself, because in a previous slide, you told me to average the any altering shoulder width conditions. Well, in that case, when we get beyond or exceed the 5 foot average, that would basically pivot us or put us into a different CMF category. At that point, then it would necessitate segmentation. So if the segment begins or ends at a crossroad terminal, length is measured from the near edge of the crossroad traveled way. And if you have a horizontal curve within a segment that doesn't comprise the entire segment, you don't have to separate out. There are other facility types, for instance, 2-lane rural highways, where every horizontal curve, by definition, becomes its own unique segment. That's not the case with freeways. It has the ability for a segment, if part of that segment incorporates a horizontal curve, to deal with the horizontal curve part separately from the tangent part. Okay, so an illustrative example here showing the beginning ramp mile. You have your gore point, and you see milepost 0 for our ramp begins at that gore point. This is an exit ramp on a CD road and an entrance ramp with a speed change lane. And you can see the entrance ramp there, and the mile point 0 starts near the edge of that crossroad. Okay, here's an example for horizontal curve. The curve location, our ramp mile distance along the ramp to the start of the curve. So then we establish 1 milepost 0.0 for all segments on the ramp, and 1 milepost 0.0 for all ramps with a common ramp entrance or exit location. Then the curve data are entered in progression based on the direction of travel. So you can see we have this common ramp entrance we establish at that gore point. This for this exit ramp, 0.0 for both ramps that exist when you have multiple ramps at this location. And then we have the beginning point for the curve alignment as well. So for this, here in a special case, we have 2 ramp mile zeros for the case where we have 2 ramps combined. So the goal is to estimate the average curve entry speed on these segments. For these segments, use the higher, use ramp mile 0 of the higher volume ramp. So the higher volume ramp will dictate. So ramp 1 here has the highest volume, so its milepost 0.0 is used for the combined entrance ramp segments. And you can see these are 2 separate entrance ramps. Okay, so for off-segment curves, these are the curve location here. We need data for all curves located prior to the ramp segment. So ramps with 2 or more segments, the prior segment curves will be off segment, and then the curve data entered in the progression direction of travel, for instance, here. So with this, you see changes from 1 lane to 2 lanes, and we may have this off segment curve that exists upstream in segment 1 of segment 2. Excuse me. God. Sorry about that. Okay, so now inputting these data for our off segment curves, you can see we're in the ramp segments worksheet, and we've got segment 2 and segment 3 here. We have one for horizontal curve in segment that has a 780-foot curve radii, and that is also an off segment curve for segment 3, and you have the same information we put in there for that. So there is curve 1 and curve 2 as indicated here, and how that would be input into this exit 1 and north exit 1 and exit 2 segmentation. All right, so let me segue for a moment here back to the spreadsheet to illustrate where this falls. So the next tab over from our freeway segments is, if I can show you here, make this a little bit smaller, you'll see here input ramp segment data. And from this, you can see for that same example, we have segment 1, segment 2, segment 3, segment 4, up through segment 6. And we've got our horizontal curve data in segment or off segment as identified here. And you go through systematically the same way we did for the freeway segments, the cross-sectional roadside, ramp access, traffic data, crash data, and then for the output, you can see the output for our ramp segments. Scroll here. Oops. Do it here. Output for our ramp segments is shown here with our CMFs. And again, yesterday I touched on when and where to use the ISAT-E versus IHSDM. One of the benefits of ISAT-E, it provides you the CMFs visually on this tab. IHSDM, it's more of a black box. You don't get to see some of how the sausage is made and the stats or the predictions are developed, but you do get to see that in the ISAT-E. And then if I go to the output summary, let me enlarge that, and you can see the total crashes for the entire facility. And as you scroll down, or excuse me, scroll across here. Hide this. You will be able to identify crashes across the different facility types. So, for instance, there's our ramp crash. We have the freeway segment crashes, the ramp crashes, and then the crossroad ramp terminal crashes. So for that example that was put in there, we end up with 6 total predicted, or 6 sites with about 5 total crashes predicted for our ramps. You'll oftentimes, in an effort to capture kind of like a scale and magnitude, typically because your ramps comparatively to the segments are a shorter distance, the power and factor that has the greatest influence on the number of crashes predicted is ADT and the length, the exposure data. So that's why you're likely to see, when it comes down to crash predictions, that the ramps themselves comparatively will have fewer crashes because they represent a smaller proportion of the roadway mileage for our analysis segment. All right, let me pause here. That gets us through ramps. Any comments or questions before we take our second break? I realize, again, I'm empathetic to the idea here that it's a lot of content covered in a short period of time. It's almost like drinking from a fire hose. You really do the best you can and trying to give you the overview and cliff notes of this. But when we get into the classroom and actually work through project level decisions on that I-70 example, you really start to see the nuance and the underlying assumptions and implications of those assumptions as it relates to the output. So Again, the purpose here is more introduction and general overview as opposed to some of that nuance maybe it's not possible to cover in the short period of time we have. Okay, it's about 5 over the hour. Let's take another 10 minutes. We'll start back up with the last session for today at 5 after the hour. Right? We're going to finish up today looking at ramp terminals. And I'll preface this by saying, in the same way, when we were looking at the ramps and the ramp configurations, the most common ramp terminals as well were the ones that were initially studied. So again, if you have new configurations or these alternative intersection conditions, they may not be as readily available from the perspective of being within the predictive methods. As what you'll see here are the typical forms of intersection are traditional forms. So what we're going to do is describe these terminals and by type, the data needs, how to run the model, and then the results, how to interpret the results. So here you can see the ramp terminal configurations that can be analyzed through the Highway Safety Manual predictive methods. And you start at the top of the screen here, where you have a 3-leg diagonal exit or entrance, a 4-leg diagonal exit or entrance in the middle, and then a 4-leg, or in this case, a 4-quad Parklow A, shown at the bottom of the screen. Continuing, you can have a 4-leg diagonal, which is or a 4-leg quad or 4-quad Parklow B, 3-leg diagonal 2-quad Parklow A, and then a 3-leg diagonal 2-quad Parklow B. So you capture these different configurations, and again, going back to what we talked about with ramps, the site that you're working on and trying to predict, if it doesn't fit closely to one of these configurations, or is not operating as one of these configurations would suggest, you're going to want to be cautious in running the analysis using these models. All right, so let's take a look at the safety performance functions for these different model configurations. The general model form is shown at the top of the screen there, N sub SPF. It's an exponential function where you have your predictor variables, again, are the ADT of the crossroad, the ADT of the exit ramp, and the ADT of the entrance ramp. And then for that crossroad ADT, it equals the ADT for the inside as well as the outside legs divided by 2. And our coefficients A through D, these will change based on configuration, the type of traffic control, the area type, the number of crossroad lanes, and as well as the crash severity for which the model is predicting. If the center lines of the 2 ramps are offset by 70 feet or less, they are considered one intersection. And if the 2 ramps are offset by more than 250 feet, then each ramp terminal is considered to form a separate intersection. All right. Now, thankfully for us, we're not doing this by hand. Let me go back for a moment. But when you get to the Excel spreadsheet, you're going to want to make sure that you have selected the appropriate configuration. And the key here, because there's so many data elements, is making sure we select the right contextual models that we are applying for our project. And again, it's almost like, regardless of whether we're dealing with freeways, ramps, ramp junctions, 2-lane rural highways, multi-lane rural highways, if you don't select the appropriate facility type and contextual model that you are associated with for your project, you don't have any chance of getting results that are applicable. I mean, this is a challenging thing to explain variability in crashes using geometric traffic and treatment characteristics for a project, that you have to apply the models as they were originally intended. So now the SPFs we showed, now let's take a look at the CMFs. There are 11 for these ramp terminals, and most of them are for geometric design or traffic control variables. And they, again, were developed in combination with the development of the SPFs, meaning the same sites were used to develop the CMFs that were used to develop the SPFs. Okay, and again, these, I'll say it again, the adjustment factors are going to be the common nomenclature instead of crash modification factors as we get to HSM2. So, and then there's an asterisk on this slide. The crash risk tends to increase as the length of ramp available for deceleration to the back of queue is reduced due to long queues. And you can see that under the signalized or stop control, exit ramp capacity, that length of ramp available for deceleration variable for adjustment factor. You also have the crossroad left turn lane, crossroad right turn lane, whether they exist or not, access point frequency, the length of the segment, and median width. And then additionally, for signalized only, do we have protected only left turn phasing? Is there a channelized right turn on the crossroad? Is there a channelized right turn on the exit ramp? And does there exist a non-ramp leg? And then for stop only, the skew angle at the intersection, there's also a adjustment factor or crash modification factor for that. Okay. So here is a slide capturing the input data necessary to run the predictive methods for ramp terminals. So you first have to make sure your ramp configuration, or excuse me, your terminal configuration reflects and is selected appropriate for your project. Second, the traffic control associated with that ramp terminal. And then, do we have non-ramp public street parking? Excuse me, public street at terminal, non-ramp public street at terminal. Exit skew angle, exit ramp skew angle, the distance to the nearest public street, outside approach and inside approach. The presence of protected left turn operations, exit ramp, right turn control type, crossroad median width, crossroad through lanes, and the number of lanes on the exit approach. Again, continuing with this input data, what type of right turn channelization exists, if any? Left turn bays, width of the left turn bay, right turn bays, driveways and public streets near the terminal within 250 feet, and then traffic volumes on the crossroad as well as the ramps. So these are the data necessary to deploy these methods. Okay. So let's take a look at these data in a little more detail. The number of fully developed lanes at the exit. And for this, in order to be a lane, you have to have 150 feet or more in length for that to be added here. So you can see the length of the bay has to be greater than 100 feet. And in this case, you can see conditions where you have only 2 lanes versus 1 lane. So if you see a split that incorporates a second lane, but the distance for that is less than 100 feet, it is captured and analyzed strictly as 1 lane if that bay length is less than 100 feet. Doesn't capture it here, but I often think of the unusual scenario. What if it's exactly 100 feet? What do you do then? And this is a result of, there's a practical interpretation here where I may look at both ways, or there's a subjectivity to see how it's performing, to see which may be a better approach. So but that is very unlikely to occur. The intersection skew angle, it's the absolute value of the difference between 90 degrees and the actual intersection angle. So for this, if we were to look at that skew, you can see on the bottom right, we're looking at that 90 degrees and whatever the skew is, the difference between 90 degrees and that actual intersection angle. And then the median width is shown on the top left of this slide. So that pretty much captures the content on these ramp terminals. Now I want to segue for a moment back to the spreadsheet, and then I have some other resources I wanted to share with you for the remainder of this morning. So for the tab here, input ramp terminal data, I've clicked on that tab, and what you see again under the let me zoom in a bit before. Under the basic intersection data, you start to see at the very top the ramp terminal configuration. And if I click on that little, or hover over that little red triangle, you can see the difference, the different ramp terminal configurations. 3-leg terminal with diagonal, 3-leg terminal with diagonal either exit or entrance, 4-leg terminal with diagonal ramps, and then 4-leg park-low A, 4-leg park-low B, 2-quadrant park-low A, 2-quadrant park-low B. And then the crossroad has to provide 2-way travel. So 1-way crossroads are not supported by this. The ramp terminals is signalized 1-stop or all stop. So there was a question about, I think there was a question on stop condition. I thought I saw here. Oh, maybe I was dreaming then. All right, never mind. So those are the traffic control conditions. The is a non-ramp public street leg present at the terminal. This situation occurs occasionally. When it does, the public street leg is opposite from the one ramp, and the other ramp does not exist or is located at some distance from the subject ramp terminal such that it is not part of the terminal. Most common example is where the public street leg is opposite from the diagonal exit ramp. And if the diagonal exit ramp is present, it's not part of the terminal. The skew angle, traffic control, left turn operational modes, protected or permitted lefts, right turn approach, and the control for the right turns, your cross-sectional data, median width, number of lanes, right turn channelization, left turn bays, access data, number of driveways on the outside crossroad leg within 200 feet of the ramp terminal, and number of public street approaches on the outside crossroad leg term is captured there. So yesterday a question came up related to pedestrians and bicyclists. If you look at the output for these data, we are strictly focused on vehicle-to-vehicle crashes. And here for the ramp terminal, if I zoom in a bit, oh boy. We are strictly focused on vehicle-to-vehicle collisions. Oh, that's right, Gary. You had asked about the yield condition for traffic control. Let me go back. So for our traffic control conditions, it doesn't appear that terminal traffic control, you either have yeah, you might. I'm not sure, Giddy, if this one stop or stop control for the exit ramp that doesn't capture the scenario you're describing. So I don't think just a yield scenario would come to place. Note use one stop for unsignalized D3 entrance configurations with uncontrolled crossroad through movements because the crossroad left turn must stop to yield to oncoming through vehicles. So I do not believe that we have that capability with these models. Oh, for the right turns. I got you. I don't believe so. I believe that it's strictly right turns. You're the only two traffic controller stop condition or signalized condition. Oh no, there is yield. Sorry. Yeah, they do have yield for the right exit ramp, right right turn maneuvers. Is that what you were looking for, Giddy? Yeah, good. I think I just shifted this, so it was stop before. Okay. And then as you go back, the output summary, you will see here though, at these terminals, compared to the freeway segments and the ramp segments, for the example that we're looking at here, you start to see the total number of crashes over that 3-year period was, or is this annually? Let me see here, freeway segments, number of sites, 6 sites. You will see a representation at these intersections. You can see a large number of crashes. So this brings up a larger point of, unintended consequences. And sometimes when dealing with this, depending upon if you have jurisdictional separation between who's responsible for the freeway and then who's responsible for the crossroad, an unintended consequence could be, you address an issue on the freeway segment or the ramp, and it ends up contributing or having a counterintuitive or negative impact at the ramp terminal and the adjacent crossroads that are connecting into it. And this is something from a holistic approach that would support the use of IHSDM, because for that crossroad, by adding additional traffic or adjusting something that would influence travel demand on that crossroad, that analysis also needs to be conducted and considered. And I'll also suggest to you that fundamentally that this approach for freeway analysis, ramps, ramp junctions, of all of the predictive methods, is the one that involves the most data elements. And there's more nuance to this than the other sections. The other facility types, I should say, they're pretty straightforward in their analysis and the data elements necessary. And let me just take a moment to illustrate that by opening up the 2-lane rural spreadsheet. So in the 2-lane rural spreadsheet, you're going to be highly probably taken back at the contrast from the level of detail associated with the different tabs for the freeways, ramps, ramp junctions, and then corresponding other data elements necessary. And now if I look at, for 2-lane rurals, the corresponding, let me just show you the different tabs that exist here. You have the instructional tab with the data elements and the coding for that. And then you have segments versus intersections, and then summary tables and reference tables. So it's a lot, a simpler approach. And then if we look in at the specific data elements necessary to run 2-lane rural highway prediction, you can see they're captured here. There's, a handful, 12 or so data elements, starting with the SPF related data that are the length and ADT. And then here are this adjustment factors, or the CMFs. And it's lane width, shoulder type, curve, horizontal curve, rate, grade, driveway density, rumble strip, passing lanes, two-way left turn lanes. So it's a much more simplified procedure when dealing with non-freeways. And in fact, if I were to provide you with the research report for this, I would FHWA both predicting safety. So we call this the Red Book report because it's a red book, the red cover. But you can see the publication is from 1999. So hence the spatial and temporal difference. But for instance, for that two-lane rural highway spreadsheet, this would be the reference that you would rely on to apply that methodology. Now, again, it's a very simplistic, I shouldn't say simplistic. It is by nature, in my opinion, a rural two-lane highway. You don't have as much confounding effects in predicting crashes. So they didn't require the separation of crashes into different types, meaning multiple vehicle versus single vehicle. They just group them all together under one SPF and predict the total crashes. When you get to urban suburban, they subdivide the models and SPFs to predict crashes by type and severity. But for two-lane rurals, this is the simplest of all of the Highway Safety Manual predictive methods. And then the other thing I wanted to share with you, in as much as we just delivered over the last 2 days an introduction into these Highway Safety Manual predictive methods, there are other resources available. If you look under training on the highwaysafetymanual.org website, we have posted a bunch of webinars and training webinars that capture the variety of different applications for the Highway Safety Manual deployment. And it includes, for non-freeway facilities, these are on there, HSDM, new approaches, and then a general overview. So I encourage you to, under this training tab, take a look if you have any questions, and reach out if you are interested in finding out more. And then there's also research resources, and this kind of captures where we're heading, not just now, but into the future. So these are some of the research reports that have been published since the original 2010 publication that are directly influencing the Highway Safety Manual development. And the second edition, a lot of this work will be incorporated into it, including the NCHRP studies as well as Fed Highway studies. And if you're interested in examining and looking at some other implementation research or reference material, these resources are provided, and other related resources. I showed you the crash cost for highway safety analysis, the Meyer database, Muck and Meyer, and the Crash Data Improvement Technical Assistance Program. Whatever workshop I give related to data-driven safety analysis, when discussing the idea of the Highway Safety Manual and the concepts, I often show this website, and it is a great place to start for trying to wrap your head around what the HSM is, what it's applicable for, how it was developed, where it's heading into the future as well. Because this is a living, breathing document that the first edition, as I mentioned yesterday, is our first cut at what we know about being able to explain variability and crash risk using geometric and traffic-related variables. It will change. In my opinion, we are going to start to see some drastic improvements, especially in the field of pedestrian and bike crash prediction. Prior to 2010, when this was the initial edition was developed, the amount of work and data that were available regarding pedestrian and bike facilities was limited. So we don't have separate safety performance functions for peds and bikes. But since 2010, a lot of effort has gone into collecting that data and being able to model that, and subsequent NCHRP studies also published showing those results. All right, so I'm going to pause here and just go one last time to any questions. I don't see any. I do want to thank you for your attention. Next Friday, we'll do a similar introduction on the IHSDM, and I'll have Derek Troyer with me to help instruct that, as he is our IHSDM expert within our team. So we got out a little early today, so I hope you all have a great weekend, and we will see you again next Friday at 9 a.m. I turn it back over to you, Mike, if there's any closeout message or content we need to deliver.
Yeah, thank you, John, and for another great session. And thank you all for participating in this second session of the data-driven safety analysis. Our third virtual session will be next Friday, as John said, from 9 to noon, just like this week. And thank you all, and have a great weekend.